we're going to come up with an example for this. And so the one example that we can do is, this is making a really, really broad observation. Most of us can agree on is music, maybe not the types of music. And it's going to affect one's health, one way or the other. It can be a good thing or a bad thing. Okay, and so we can then whittle it down. Of course, if you're going to do this for real, you do some background research on the types of music and what parts of health and everything that you want to look at. Okay, so that's one thing. That's a really broad one. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and we whittle it down some for us. All right. So first of all, let's narrow it down. What's the type of music that we can study? Rap. That's one I get a lot. Of course, and I realize that there are different types that you can do, but we'll say rap just in generic form. Okay. And then we also have to then make an observation with respect to how it's affecting one's health. Okay? So what's an observation that we can make? It could be true, it could be false, because you can actually try to test something and prove that it's not true as well. So that's why I don't want any rap aficionados to get upset if someone thinks it's bad or if that's what the class decides to do. And I don't want anyone that's just anti-rap to get offended if, the other ways is the same. So what about rap music? What do we want to say about rap music? Do you think it's going to be an adverse, or is it going to be a benefit to one's health? Yeah.
Maybe showing that it promotes violence of some sort. You can disprove it.
Okay. So rap music promotes violence. Okay. So now we've got that. That's our observation. We can try to disprove it, or we can say, oh, see, there is a causality there. That means that it caused it. Okay? So we have to, that right here, what is that in our observation? There's a fancy word, it's like a Jeopardy term. That's a hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that rap music promotes violence. Whenever I was in elementary school, they always told us that you had to do the if-then statement, is if rap music promotes violence, then, and that's also true, but that's a little simplistic. And so we've made a hypothesis, and now we're going to have to test it. And so in this instance here, how can we go about testing that rap music affects? Let me clear this out so that way. That rap music affects, or that rap music promotes violence. What must we have in the experiment process of this?
Rap music.
You're going to have rap music. That's true. But what are you going to be testing it on? People. So we have our groups. We have people. In order for it to record, I got to write it on here. Fortunately, size. Okay, so we have to have our groups of people. Okay, so how many groups of people do we need? There's at least 2 groups of people. That's the important thing. What's one group of people? That's the control. And so that's the most important part of here is order to have a control. What would happen if we didn't have a control group? You wouldn't know. We wouldn't be able to say, for example, so versus the experimental, I would only be able to say experiment. So we have our, which is not even, let me put a T on there. So we have our control versus the experimental group. Now, what makes the control group versus the experimental group the experimental group? That's important for every experiment here. What would our control group be or consist of?
Normal, like what is considered standard.
Okay.
So in this case, it would be people who aren't listening to everything.
We want people not listening to any music. Okay, so there are the non-music listener group. Okay, so there's no music. So therefore the experimental group must be music. They must be listening to music. And if we really wanted to do this, and what else must be true? So this is our experimental variable, is what they call it. Music is the experimental variable. Control group doesn't have it. what other things must also be true in order for us to say it was rap music that was promoting or not promoting violence? Pardon?
They have to listen to rap music.
They have to listen to rap music, and these don't. What else? What else can you say for sure is rap music and not the fact that they were eating sugar or something, you know, caffeine?
They have to, like, be like the same age range or like.
That's it. You need to, and I'm going to run out of room, so I have to put it up here. So all the other variables have to be controlled. So they're controlled variables. Those are the dependent variables versus independent. Okay. So they need to be the same control group. I mean, same age. What else would they need to be that we need to worry about? That we got to keep the same. They got to be the same age, gender, because there is a difference between men and women and boys and girls. Even though they say now that that's female violence and female aggression is on the rise, supposedly, and there have been hypotheses on the reasons why that's true. Okay, but what else? Boy, I didn't do a very good job with that E. What else is true? Same age range, same gender.
Culture.
We want similar culture, and I'm going to use a fancy term. We want socioeconomic backgrounds to be similar, right? But we're saying culture, because we're going to have to narrow it down. So perhaps we want, 18 to 23-year-old males in Polk County or something, or you can even do it based off of ethnicities or what have you. But that's the important thing, is you got to keep everything else the same between the two groups. You only change a single variable. Okay, so now we've got our two groups of people. I'm just going to still call them control and experimental, or C. For the control group, no music. An experimental group, which is listening to rap music, but everything else is the same. Now we have to have a way to test them. That's the actual doing the experiment part. So we had our observation, we made our hypothesis, we did the experiment, or we got the two groups, we're going to do the experiment. So in this instance here, what kind of experiment can we do in order to measure violence? What are some of the testing methods? And I'm not a behavioral science or social scientist, so I may not get the right terms here, so please forgive me if you are. So how do you measure violence?
And you can do like.
I know how they do it in medical school, like, with rats or whatever, but not with, like, people. I can't stick them in a cage and see how often.
Monkeys.
Or, but if we're looking right now, we said we're using people, so we're going to have to look at something in order to use that. So what are we using?
The words they say.
Maybe words or language.
You have to watch them 24/7 or record them.
Unless we do something else. Where's the controlled environment that we could use? School. Why don't we do it with school? So then we really narrowed it down. Let's go here to Crystal Lake Middle School, which actually is I don't know if any of you know Crystal Lake Middle School, but it's supposed to be one of the more violent ones, supposedly, in Polk County. My wife actually was going to ask to interview there. I was like, oh, please don't. Please don't. Yeah.
Both groups can have debates, considering debates can get hectic, and one with no music, and then one can have rap music and see, how heated the argument gets.
Okay, so we could do something like that, where we're looking into, obviously we wouldn't be debating each other, because we'd want to see that and count the number of, I don't know, if we want to go back to words used, count the number of, like, those insightful words versus calming words. Or we could look at something else. What else could we look at? Not that we're actually,
You can look at body language.
body language. And so there are psychologists and people there that do, like, the open versus closed, and also there is, like, physical violence, which, what are some of the things that we can look at just in that instance that schools usually keep good track of? I don't want to say the word, but what else could we use? Like, if they are really aggressive, what happens? Like, what do they do sometimes?
Curse.
They could curse.
You could keep track of, like, their suspension or, like...
That's it. The school records. Like, how many often times do they get detention or suspension? How many times do they go into the principal's office? Things like the school records. So, but the whole idea there is that we have some type of method of measuring it. So we have to have the same method of measurements. And so we've already thought of lots of different ways. And if this was on an exam or a quiz or like an exam, I mean, I would have accepted any of those as long as you used the same of measurement. Okay, so let's go. And so we've done the accepted the hypothesis, we tested the experiment, then you have to analyze those results. So if you were analyzing the language, we would look at the number or the types of words used between the two groups to draw our conclusions. We were looking at body language. I know with mice and rats there are certain body languages that are considered aggressive, but you would have to have someone observing them. So I guess it would be from the cameras or what have you, if we were using people. We were looking at school records or suspension records, whatever, but you have to be able to analyze it and to draw the conclusions. Okay, and from that, you do the next part, is you compare that to your hypothesis. So, if the hypothesis was that it promoted violence and there was an increase in the number of suspensions, then that would support our hypothesis. If there wasn't, then it doesn't support, so we have to go up and modify the hypothesis accordingly. So instead of promoting violence, if it was the inverse, perhaps it doesn't promote violence, and it's a different outlet for the aggression, or that it has no effect whatsoever. Okay? And so if you wanted to see, if it was an outlet for aggression, then perhaps you want to go and recheck your data to see if the inverse was true, if maybe the number of words incited, went down, or so on and so forth. So that's really the whole idea of research, is you have to do it, and you're constantly modifying your hypotheses based off of the data that you've got before. And don't be surprised if on an exam or something I gave you a hypothesis and just asked you what would be your control group versus an experimental group, or or if I gave you an experimental group to come up with a control group or something like that, or have you propose a little something. And sometimes I even have it's like a take-home assignment where you just come up with your own hypothesis and your own control experimental group as well. Okay, are there any questions over this before we go on to the U.S. versus British system and move into the actual realm of forensic science? Okay. All right. So there are two, in the way that crime labs and forensic labs just in general are organized, there are two prime examples that are often used. One is here in the United States, one the U.S. does it, versus the British system, in the way that a lot of the people that live under the United Kingdom, for example, and the countries that are from the United Kingdom tend to operate, okay? So, if we just wanted to look at the two, we would have the U.S. versus the British. What is it like here in the United States? British. What is it like in the United States? Let's say that we have a crime scene that has DNA evidence that we want to have analyzed. Okay, so what happens? Where does it go? Or maybe it doesn't have to do that. Let's just say that we have a blood sample that we want to have analyzed. The police have collected it. Where do they send it usually? To a lab, right? To the lab. And where is the lab? Where is one of the places for the lab here in the United States? The ME's office. And if the ME doesn't have the right testing, they may send it on to the state, and then ultimately they may even send it on to the FBI. And so what happens here in the United States is we usually have independent local labs, okay? Who funds these labs? The state, the government. They are government funded. It's important. So your tax dollars, I mean, yes, you could also say, the citizens fund it in that sense. But yeah, it's government funded. It's not like, if we wanted to have something sent off, that blood evidence sent off, or the fingerprint, and you wanted to use IAFIS, which is, you'll find out later on that that's what they use for fingerprinting, that you have to pay for it. That the Polk County would have to say, okay, we got to pay to have this run to the database. It's government funding. There's funding for it. At least at this time, there's funding for it. All right. So since it's government funded, it's free to the police and the prosecutor's office. And of course, they have to make it, if the prosecutor does it, then they have to make their findings public to the defense and stuff like that, so that way they can form a defense against it. That's different than the British system. Okay? Let me change colors. There's a difference. The British system, where ours is this decentralized in that sense. So like Florida has their own. I'm originally from the state of Missouri, so Missouri, a lot of this is done through Missouri Highway Patrol. And then they would send it on to the FBI for certain things, certain types of DNA. Well now, even in Missouri, now they've even formed, and the way it's here in Florida, they formed regional task force, and so that can do certain types of DNA testing and fingerprinting and things like that. But in the British system, it's different. That is a national system. Okay, so it's centralized. That's supposed to be national. NAT. Well, it's national system. Just trust me on that one. I'm having problems writing today. Okay, so it's a centralized thing. However, when you compare to government funding, it's limited government funding. That's a huge difference there. So I don't know how many of you have watched some of the British mysteries and British crime shows and movies. Sometimes they talk about the funding. And the reason why they do is they actually have to pay for it. So it's called fee-per-service privilege. So that means they have to pay, like, if we were there, for example, Polk County would have to pay a certain amount in order to send that off for DNA testing. Right. So it's a fee per service. Now that's not to say here in the United States that people sometimes don't send things off to an independent agency, especially for the defense and even sometimes for the prosecuting office, where they want an outside source and then there would be a fee for it. But just to send it to the FBI, if a police is sending it to the FBI, then it's not. Then it's free to the police and the prosecuting office. Okay, so those are the big two differences of it. Are there any questions over the British versus the U.S. system? This one, the U.S. is called a decentralized because it's each state and locality does their own, has their own capabilities. And for example, we pay taxes in order to support the sheriff's department and things like that. Whereas the British, they don't, because it's national, so it's a centralized organization. However, the individual departments would have to pay for theirs. All right. And then we have the services of the crime. I'm actually not going to go into a lot of detail with that one because on your own you should look that up. Like I said, it's pages 18 to 23 if you have version 1, 14 to 18 if you have the second edition. But we're talking things here like document examination, fingerprint units, DNA or the biological fluids. Sometimes it's called biological fluids because the same lab will do both DNA, semen samples, blood samples, things like that. Arson, obviously, will be an arson investigation. Right. What we want to really start focusing on now is the admissibility of evidence. Now, I want you to know important court cases and the general guidelines in particular. Okay, and we're actually going to first go over the court cases, and there's only 5 court cases I want you to know. Okay. And the first court case that I want you to know about, well, it really actually didn't happen until the 1900s here in the United States. We were kind of behind the times compared to some of the other countries. Like in France, over in Europe, they had already started to do a lot with respect to how it was like having a centralized area and collecting the evidence and the admissibility there. But the first one it's called Fry v. U.S., and they still talk about it. In fact, I want to say it was an episode of, I can't remember which show it was, just recently that someone talked about the Fry standard. That's what they're talking. It's Fry v. U.S., and it's from 1923. Okay. And we're talking about important court cases with respect to forensic science and the admissibility of evidence. And so they used a term that really stuck for a long, long time. What the Fry v. U.S. said is they just said that for scientific evidence to be admissible in court, it just has to be generally accepted, and that's in quotation marks, generally accepted by the scientific community. So what's some of the problems with that? Generally accepted by the scientific community. Someone who's going to be pre-law, or what's a potential problem? For the most part that works a lot of times, but there are some limitations to that.
How do you define general?
Yeah, generally is kind of vague. And also, what's the scientific community that they're talking about? If you're looking at DNA evidence, are you going to go to a meteorologist? That's another person in the scientific community that he or she knows talking about the weather. Just like if you're going to talk to me, I know nothing about the weather. I know very little about the weather. So I wouldn't be the scientific community, but some people could argue, well, it just said that it's generally accepted by the scientific community. It doesn't necessarily say which scientific community. And perhaps it's generally accepted by that community. And so then there were some changes. Okay? And in particular, what came around is called, and here I'll write it up because it'd take me a long time to write on there. The next is the Federal Rules of Evidence Alternative. So, Federal Rules of Evidence Alternative, which has a much more common name, because in particular within that we're talking about Rule 702. Okay, and they made it much more detailed. Okay, so Rule 702, what it does is there are three caveats, three parts to it. One is that the testimony must be based on fact or data, which before that just seems like it's common sense. But you know what? It wasn't explicitly stated by the Fry standard. It must be based on facts or data. Okay? Secondly, the testimony has to be the product of reliable principles and methods. So however you got that data, it has to be for reliable principles and methods. Reliable principles, which I'm just going to be abbreviating, or methods. And then thirdly, this one is a really long one, makes sense. Let me give an example. Because sometimes, what it is it says that the witness has applied those principles and methods reliably to the facts of the case. And that's to prevent someone, a expert testimony to get up there. Let's say that you found some DNA evidence, okay? But you get this expert up there, and he starts talking on and on and on to try to confuse possibly the jury about blood evidence. You know, it could be true. Oh, this blood type, blah 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 blah. And goes on and on and on. He talks around it. But those are reliable principles, but it's not used appropriately for the data that was collected. Okay, so what that's saying is that you've got to have, the witness has got to apply those methods to the facts of that case. Okay, so let me see. So apply. Yes. Hi.
My screen just went out.
Oh, I haven't touched anything, so it's not me. Are you sure that you? Because there are ways to turn it on. There should be ways here. If you should come here, I can show you. Because I found this out. If you go to Help and you go to Tools, and the screen up and screen down.
Oh, okay. But I mean, it turned the projector off too.
Oh, because it's got a time limit. And so I think that if nothing's been touched for so long, it may just automatically turn off. But no, I haven't touched anything. You're welcome. But yeah, it's also turned the TVs off in here, by the way.
Oh.
Because normally it just says no data or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now I've got to find the way back out of this. There we go. All right. So you applied those methods. I'm just going to abbreviate it as meth. All right, so you applied the methods reliably to the facts of the case. Another way to think about that is what happens if you have a DNA evidence person who's talking about DNA evidence, but it's not necessarily the facts of that case. Like, it was a hit and run, and he's talking about DNA, but there's no DNA that was collected. So why? It doesn't matter. So sometimes they like to try to just confuse the issue. The facts of the case. Okay. So that's Rule 702. The third one that I want you to know about, which I forgot my eraser. Okay. Is Daubert. And I'll spell that one. It's got quite the name. It's Daubert. I mean, this in Rule 702 and the Frye Standard went all the way until the 1990s. Okay? So, Daubert v. Merrill. I don't remember the background story behind this. Dow Pharmaceuticals, Inc. And because by this time, science had really started to develop. In the 90s and 2000s now, science is growing so fast and the methods are coming around so fast that it's not catching up with the legal system. Or that's what some are saying, it wasn't catching up with the legal system. And so that's 1993. So that's at least within my lifetime. Hopefully within some of it. Well, no, that's like 20. Never mind. So not within your lifetime, most likely. Maybe some of you. So 22, 23 years ago. And what they said is before then that the Frye Standard, or before then they were still talking about the Frye Standard, and the methods that were being used there were becoming newer and newer. Okay, and so the problem that they were having was they were arguing and went before the Supreme Court that the new methods weren't holding up to the Frye Standard, because what happens if it becomes so specific that it's not by the entire scientific community, that there could be some disagreement between different scientists. So, for example, if we have like climate change, there are some scientists that say that the causality is directly due to rising carbon emissions from humans, and some would say no, that's cyclical, that's rise of carbon emissions, that's a cyclical thing that's regardless of ours. And so they are both scientific communities, and they both have acceptance here. And so what Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals Inc. 1993, which is a mouthful, it said that the Frye standard isn't absolute prerequisite for admissibility under Rule 707. Sorry, 702, I'm sorry. Okay? So it said you could have competing ideas if you want to think of it that way. Then we have the next one is Kumho Tires, which are still around. Technically, it's Kumho Tires Company Limited, blah, blah, blah. But Kumho Tires is the important part, for me at least. V. Carmichael. And that's in 1999. Does anyone see, what's one problem so far that hasn't been addressed yet? We've talked about the admissibility, but there's one thing that has not been specifically stated, and that's who determines, and we talked about, how there has to be a science community that accepts the methods, and the methods have to be reliably presented before, to the facts of the case and everything. But the problem here is who determines whether or not that really is the right scientific community to use, and that the methods have been applied to the case, and all of that kind of information. That hasn't been specifically stated right now. And so what Kumho Tires versus V. Carmichael did is it ruled that the trial judge is the gatekeeper of expert witness and the evidence admissibility, which seems really, to me, it seems common sense. That's who says that something is sustained or not. So, but that is, they like to use that term, gatekeeper, which reminds me of the old Ghostbusters movie, The Gatekeeper. The trial judge is the gatekeeper of the admissibility of scientific evidence, and whether or not that's an expert witness. And then finally, and this one has Florida ties. I one reason I put it in, but not only that, but it's really, really important for now. And that's Coppolino. That one I do know, I don't know if I spelled his name right. V. State, Florida, technically, but V. State. Okay, and I don't know the year, I don't have the year written down for that one. But that's been in the last, within my lifetime easily. In the 90s or early 2000s. And I'll tell you a little story about Coppolino versus State. If I remember correctly, and I may get the names wrong, or the profession wrong, or the location wrong, but I wouldn't say that he's around the Pensacola area, Panama City, that general area of Florida. He was a doctor and he was married. And what happened was that he was having an affair, and essentially they wanted to kill the spy. And their spouse died. Okay, and it just seemed really obvious that this spouse died due to being poisoned, but they couldn't determine what that poison was. Okay, the forensic investigators, the ME, he or she took out the blood samples, they sent it off to the testing and stuff that they had, but they just knew that this woman, I wouldn't say it was a husband, it was a doctor, and it was a woman, the spouse, but the spouse had died from being poisoned. And now mine is going to be doing that. Isn't that just lovely? So we're gonna have to let them know that they don't have the time limits on this quite right. So what they did in Coppolino v. State is the fact, I'll have to write it up here, is the way that they went about. I think it may even be the University of Florida, but they asked some of the professors to come up and to screen for things that could possibly be in the blood that could have killed this woman. Like, what were some of the poisons and toxins that the doctor would have had access to? and one of them has to do with a substance called succinate, and it's actually a metabolite, or it's related to a metabolite that's normally in your body. Okay, and the thing of it is, it degrades pretty fast, but it's toxic. It's actually, if you take it in a certain form, it's toxic. Just like there are lots of parts of your body that tools. He's not even let me look at the tools display on. It's not even let me turn it on. So they came up with the succinate, but since it's a brand new technique, and lo and behold, they found a way that this woman had such high elevated levels of succinate, and they showed that in the normal population and stuff, that it's not at those high levels, and that it was toxic, and this is something that someone who works in a medical profession or a science profession would have access to, and they were able to show that the doctor is the one that had the access to it and everything like that. Well, so that went through the court case, and he was found guilty of murdering his spouse because with succinate. And so then what happens is, as one of the judges, or they argued that, you know what, since that was a brand new technique that had been developed, there was not a scientific community that had been established, that had published it and had decided that that was a reliable source. And so that really limited, so the judge was going to throw it out. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court stuff, and they said, no, the prosecution made the argument that science is expanding so rapidly, and it takes a long time for it to be published, that it's difficult to find the community that would be able to ascertain whether or not that this should be admissible. And so what that determined is that novel techniques, something that's been new, brand new, may be admissible in court. So he was still found guilty. So if you can find enough scientists or people in that field that will say, hey, this works, we've done the controls to show that the normal population in this instance has normal amounts of succinate, and if you increase it, you're going to kill somebody. The doctor had access to it, and I don't remember, he had fingerprints or what have you. They showed that he was able to have administered it, so therefore he's the person that caused her death. Then that should be admissible in court. And so nowadays, newer science techniques can be made, and it can be admissible in court, even if it hasn't been through the ringer, so to speak, in the scientific community. Okay? Are there any questions on these? Kimmel was the gatekeeper. This one says the whole idea is that the Frye standard isn't the absolute prerequisite for federal courts, at least. And then Bill 702 is the fact that it's got to be reliably used, and the Frye is the one that says that it's going to take about scientific community. Okay? And that's, for the most part, with the exception of when we talk about the constitutional amendments, that's the extent of the legal cases that I talk about in this class. So I'll go ahead and end class with prayer. So, dear Heavenly Father, I want to praise you and thank you for the fact that today is Friday and we have the weekend to look forward to. I ask that you guide us and direct us, make your Spirit manifest in our lives, and let us know your will for our lives. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Are you?
Pardon?
Are you collecting?
What you does is if you need to take a picture, scan it, and upload it.
Oh, that's right.
That
Okay.
link. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll misplace it.
You said it was okay if we just type her name on the
Yeah,
thing?
because as long as you upload it electronically,
Like,
then
you know where
it's...
it says signature, just type her name? Okay.
Yeah, I accept that because it can only come from you since it's on your account, so I think
Okay.
it's legal.
Did you want the syllabus signed?
And that's what she was asking, and you can do it electronically and just
Is it the
upload it
same place?
electronically.
'Cause I know there was the plagiarism had a swap, but I didn't see one for the syllabus.
Oh, right, it's in the plagiarism one, all I did was I just took the last
Oh, so
page
you
and
just
put
have to
it.
do one?
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
See ya.